Reading 1. A Letter. As an American immersion teacher, I was enthused to see the letter from John Brown about the American immersion experience. I would like to take this opportunity to expand upon and challenge some of his views. I agree that the American immersion and bilingual schools have been successful in producing functionally bilingual students. In the province of Arizona, there are German, French, Ukrainian and Swedish immersion schools, Hebrew bilingual schools and a school for native Indian students. Mr. Brown's suggested condition that teachers in these schools must be fully bilingual may be unnecessary. For example, primary teachers can and do function with a smaller vocabulary than secondary teachers. Secondly, it is doubtful that students will use English because they understand and accept the objective of making English the language of the classroom, which is a rather sterile motive. One reason that American immersion programs work is because of the commitment to whole language learning. That is, children learn a language by using it to transmit or receive meaningful messages that are interesting, real, and important. They want to make their needs and desires known and to understand the world around them. Immersion programs integrate language and content in an activity-based, child-centered manner so that the child is motivated to use the second language as a tool to transmit and receive messages related to social and academic interests. In addition, the second language is modelled throughout the school, is encouraged and rewarded, and thus becomes the language of choice. An immersion programme should provide some daily instruction in the first language. Mr. Brown's third argument, that all the students in one class need to be at approximately the same level of English proficiency when they switch to English, is unrealistic and unprofitable. How does a teacher group children who have a huge vocabulary but poor grammar skills, and others who have correct grammar but a poor vocabulary? Also, suppose the students have similar language abilities but different learning styles. The odds are that a teacher at any point in time will be teaching at a level that is too difficult for 1/3, too easy for 1/3, and appropriate for the final 1/3 of the students. Hence the concept of cooperative learning. Students in heterogeneous groups with a mixture of personalities, talents and weaknesses better as they cooperate instead of compete and depend on each other for support and information. This type of learning environment frees the teacher from the traditional lecturing mode in favour of circulating, monitoring and challenging the students to make use of their different experiences to expand their knowledge and skills. I support immersion programs because children who learn a second language partake in an educational experience that expands their horizons in addition to their cognitive, social and affective capabilities. Important goals of education indeed. Reading 2. Unemployment rate on the rise. The new Finance Minister, Peter Jones, has said he is committed to the principle and philosophy of finance management enshrined by his predecessor, Richard Ellington. It was really not surprising to hear such a message, as our government has consistently reiterated its non-interventionist policy. Our government is proud of the low taxation policy, free market operation, and the enterprising nature of the economy, as it believes that all these lay the strong financial foundations that make possible the economic boom in New Zealand. Hence, the role of the government is to interfere as little as possible in the public sector, for fear of damaging the normal operation of the market. Government spending, in money terms, has never exceeded 30% of the gross domestic product, GDP, since 1950. Many people in New Zealand are scared by the spectre of unemployment and yet the government has done nothing to solve the problem because administration officials do not want to spoil the miraculous market mechanism. There is talk of self-help by entrepreneurs involved in the market. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate is rocketing. I believe the government should act to combat this problem. Owing to the lack of a comprehensive unemployment security scheme and unemployment insurance which exists in the US, New Zealand's jobless suffer more psychological and social pressure than their American counterparts. The unemployed have a heavy psychological burden to bear. This can lead to them having feelings of low self-esteem and a feeling that they are worthless. Those who seek help from the Social Welfare Department, SWD, have to endure the complicated application procedure and the inhumane and harsh means test. The procedure to apply for assistance is not as easy as one would imagine. This puts the unemployed under great pressure. I do not believe that maintaining a policy of minimal government intervention will ever stem rising unemployment. The government should make its invisible hand in the market become visible by, for example, creating more job opportunities for the unemployed, ensuring age and sex discrimination do not exist in the workplace, restraining employers from exploiting employees in the way that some employers do by taking on casual staff and making them work long hours, and, finally, bringing under control the crazy property speculation of capitalists. Reading 3. How the Chinese Mind Ticks. Not even a 3-day brainstorming session among top psychologists at the Chinese university could unravel one of the world's greatest puzzles: how the Chinese mind ticks. Richard Evans had reason to pace the pavement of the Chinese university campus last week. The psychologist who coordinated and moderated a 3-day seminar in Chinese psychology, and most of the participants came a long way to knock heads. "If a bomb hit this building," muttered Evans, half seriously, "it would wipe out the whole discipline." But the only thing that went off in the conference hall of Chinese university was the picking of brains, the pouring out of brains, and a refrain from an ongoing mantra: "More work needs to be done," or "We don't know." Each of the 47 participants was allowed 30 minutes plus use of an overhead projector to condense years of research into data and theories. Their content spilled over from 20 areas of Chinese behaviour, including reading, learning styles, psychopathology, social interaction, personality, and modernisation. An overriding question for observers, however, was why, in this group of 30 Chinese and 17 non-Chinese, weren't there more professionals from mainland China presenting research on the indigenous people? Richard Turner, a psychiatrist who works in Hubei province, explained, "The Cultural Revolution silenced and froze the research," said the American-born doctor who has lived and worked in China for more than 15 years. And 17 years later, research is underway, but it's too early to have anything yet. Besides, most of the models being used are from the West anyway. In such a specialised field, how can non-Chinese academics do research without possessing fluency in Chinese? Those who cannot read, write or speak the language usually team up with Chinese colleagues. In 10 years, we won't be able to do this. "It's a money thing," said John Flint of Arizona Institute of Technology, who described himself as an illiterate Guelo who lacks fluency in Chinese. He said that 93% of the non-Chinese authors in his field cannot read Chinese. Dr. Flint raised questions such as why is research dependent on university students? Why is research done on Chinese people in coastal cities, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore and Shanghai, but not inland? Chinese psychology is too Confucian, too neat. He's been dead a long time. How about the guy on a motorcycle in Taipei? Dr. Flint said, urging that research have a more contemporary outlook. The academics came from Germany, France, Israel, Sweden, Taiwan, Singapore, United States and Hong Kong. Many of the visual aids they used by way of illustration contained eye-squinting type and cobweb-like graphs. One speaker, a sociologist from France, even warned her colleagues that she would not give anyone enough time to digest the long, skinny columns of numbers. Is Chinese intelligence different from Western? For half of the audience who are illiterate in Chinese, Professor Jack Chan of Taiwan University examined each of the Chinese characters for intelligence. Phrases such as a mind as fast as an arrow and connections between strokes for sun and the moon were made. After his 35-minute speech, Chan and the group lamented that using Western tests are the only measure available to psychologists who are starving for indigenous studies of Chinese by Chinese. How do Chinese children learn? George Brown of Hong Kong University zeroed in on deep learning versus surface. Deep is when the student is sincerely interested for his own reasons. Surface is memorizing and spitting out facts. It doesn't nurture any deep understanding. If the language of instruction happens to be the children's second language, students in Hong Kong have all sorts of challenges with English-speaking teachers from Britain and America with accents and colloquialisms. Do Westerners have more self-esteem than Chinese? Dr. Liang Fang, chairman of the psychology department of Chinese University, points his finger at belief systems. The collectivist mindset often stereotypes Chinese unfairly. The philosophy of UN is concept used to explain good and bad events which are predetermined and out of the individual's control. Does not foster a positive self-concept. Neither do collectivist beliefs such as sacrifice for the group, compromise and importance of using connections. If a Chinese loses or fails, he has a stronger sense of responsibility. He tends to blame it on himself. A non-Chinese from the West may blame it on forces outside himself, Dr. Liang said. By the end of the 3-day session, there were as many questions raised as answered. It was agreed there was room for further research. To the layman, so much of the discussion was foreign and riddled with jargon and ongoing references to studies and researchers. The work of the participants will resurface in a forthcoming Handbook of Chinese Psychology, which will be edited by Dr. Evans. Reading 4. Chinese Economy. Over the past decade, there has been a sea of change in China's economic policies. Like other developing countries which are attempting to become more export-oriented, China has started to set up free trade zones. These zones are called Special Economic Zones, SEZs, and feature various incentives designed to encourage foreign investment. What is the significance of these zones? Have they really played an important role in the development of the economy of China? In this paper, I will first describe the background to the establishment of these zones, looking at China's economy before the 1970s. Then I describe some of the aims and characteristics of the SEZs. Lastly, I attempt to assess the significance of the SEZs in the development of the wider Chinese economy. Historically, China has adopted an inward-looking strategy to its economic development. Successive Chinese governments thought that the economy could grow purely through self-reliance. However, there are always limitations to what a country can do by itself. For example, limitations in raw materials, natural resources, technology, etc. These can hold back the growth of an economy, and certainly China's economic growth lagged far behind much of the rest of the world up to the 1970s. By contrast, countries like the USA were achieving significant economic growth in this period because they were practicing foreign trade policies which facilitated free trade. Any shortages in the domestic economy, for example oil in the USA or Japan, wheat in the Soviet Union, or cars in India, could be compensated for by inputs. Foreign trade, then, could help to aid economic growth. The export trade is also vital. Not only can exports be a means of paying for imports, but they also help to earn foreign exchange. Since 1977, the Chinese government has recognized the importance of exports as a means of fostering economic growth. Economic policies and special incentive programs have been introduced to increase exports. One measure taken was the opening of the 5 special economic zones. The aims of the establishment of the SEZs were to earn foreign exchange, to enhance employment, to attract foreign investment, and to accelerate the introduction of technology and management expertise. The 5 SEZs established were Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Shantou in Gaozhong Province, Xiamen in Fujian Province, and Hainan Island. In order to attract foreign investors and develop foreign trade, the 5 SEZs offer similar packages of favourable incentives to foreign firms. One of the most attractive points of these packages is that income tax is fixed at the rate of 15%, lower than that in other parts of China. Other advantages such as tax exemptions, land use rights, and banking and finance privileges are not available to firms operating outside the SEZs. Many other non-financial advantages are provided inside the SEZs. Firms are provided relatively free market environments with minimal government intervention. This means that private and joint venture enterprises are free to hire their own workers. They are also free to set wages to reflect market conditions. Bonuses can be awarded to workers for outstanding performance. The favourable impact of the SEZs on the economy of China is 5-fold. They attract foreign investment. They help the growth of the export industry. They earn foreign exchange. They provide employment opportunities. And lastly, they help the indigenous economy improve its level of technology. I would now like to look at some of these points in more detail. The preferential treaties of the SEZs have attracted foreign investors to invest a huge amount of money in China. For instance, Hainan and Xiamen have attracted investments mostly from Taiwan. By June 1985, a total foreign investment of $3.15 billion had been made in the 5 zones, amounting to 1/4 of the total foreign investment in China during this period. The most marked success was registered in Shenzhen. By the end of 1984, it accounted for $1.8 billion through more than 4,000 economic cooperation agreements. One significant factor is that the investment has not been confined to the export industry, but has permeated other sectors such as infrastructure construction, commerce, tourism, and real estate. The establishment of the SEZs has opened a way for China to increase its trade with foreign countries. They not only enhance trading activities such as foreign investment and tourism, but also help China to earn foreign exchange through these activities. As all 5 SEZs are coastal cities, they are convenient for ocean transport routes and help to promote the export industry. Preferential policies have encouraged foreigners to set up export-oriented factories in the territories. From 1983 to 1985, an annual average real growth rate of 78% was recorded for exports from the 5 zones. Shenzhen's exports, for example, grew at an average rate of 65% during this period. At the same time, the proportion of the SEZ's industrial products which went to export had risen by 50% by 1985. Since the beginning of the open door policy, small-scale private businesses have been allowed to coexist with state enterprises. This has increased employment opportunities for local people and raised the level of economic activity. Also, many state workers sense that going into business on their own may provide greater income potential. Many prefer to work for joint venture firms for higher wages. So, the average income in the SEZs now ranks as the highest in China. In theory, advanced technology and know-how will also flow into the country as a result of foreign investment. In turn, with increasing exports, the force of international competition may bring greater pressure on Chinese firms to adopt more efficient work practices. It is perhaps questionable how much benefit the wider Chinese economy has reaped from these investments. The technology, patents, and know-how remain firmly the property of and are controlled by the parent companies. It may, however, be the case that in the long run the work culture and practices adopted by foreign companies could have some washback effect over wider economic practices in the country. In conclusion, the establishment of the SEZs has helped to increase the export trade, which in turn has helped to improve the Chinese economy. Preferential treaties have been offered in the 5 SEZs to attract foreign investment. A large amount of foreign investment has occurred, not only in the export trade, but also in infrastructure construction, commerce, and tourism. Foreign companies have been encouraged to set up factories in the territories, and the export industry has grown. Job opportunities have been provided for locals as factories need labour, and the average income of the people has increased. In addition, advanced foreign technology has been brought in with the inflow of foreign investment. All these factors have contributed to the growth of the Chinese economy. It remains to be seen if these quantitative advances, in which the SEZs have played an important role, are matched by the commensurate advances in the quality of life for the majority of Chinese people. Reading 5. Computers start to change our lifestyle. The history of the computer in the 20th century is one of dramatic adaptation and expansion. The computer had modest beginnings in areas where it was used as a specialist tool. The first electronic computer was built in the 1930s and was solely for the use of undergraduate students in Dallas State University to handle mathematical computations in nuclear physics. During World War II, computers were developed in order to wage counter-espionage and break codes used by the enemy. In the post-war years, the scope of computers was expanded to include the military-industrial complex and academia. Obviously, people needed to communicate around these institutions, and so there was a need for early network tools. In the 1960s, an early version of the Internet, ARPANET, was used in computer science and engineering projects. However, only 10 years later, computers were starting to change our lifestyle. the way we do business, and many other things, and by the late 1980s, networks were expanding to embrace sections of the general public. The Internet was born. What are the effects of this dramatic change in the use of computers in everyday life? In this paper, I will restrict the focus to changes in learning style of US students due to computers. Are the effects all positive, or are there drawbacks as well? Computerization has changed US high school education in many ways. I will discuss 3 different changes that I consider to be important. The first is the use of the computer as a teaching aid for teachers. The next is the massive data storage and fast data retrieval facilitated by computer. Then I will look into the changes brought about by the introduction of simulation software. Lastly, I will briefly discuss some problems which have resulted from computerization. How prevalent is the use of computers in school? As recently as the early 1980s, only 15% of secondary science teachers in the USA were using microcomputers. However, since then, high schools in the US have computerized rapidly. By 1986, schools had acquired about 1.3 million computers, with 90% of public schools having at least one computer. Computers can be used as a teaching aid both in schools and in homes. In schools, for example, teachers can plug a computer into an especially equipped overhead projector to bring text, graphics, sound and videos into a classroom. By these multimedia computer animations, teachers can more readily attract and retain students' attention. Mary White concludes that computer-aided teaching can attract and motivate students who were dropping out when more traditional methods were being used. Computer animation can also speed up the teaching process and make more difficult to explain ideas straightforward. For instance, a curved plane in 3-dimensional space may take a teacher several minutes to explain or draw by hand, but on a computer, it requires only a few keystrokes or mouse clicks in order to provide a visual representation. Another example is visualization by computer software. For example, the relative vibration and stretch of atoms in a molecule at different temperatures can be simulated and visualized by computer software, making this abstract microscopic behavior easy to understand. This means that teachers can spend more time answering students' questions and catering for other needs. According to Mary White, computer software can shorten the learning process by illustrating real-world applications of abstract theories. The use of CD-ROM as a means of storage is becoming very popular. A book contains, at most, 1,000 pages or so. A single-sided conventional 5-inch CD-ROM, on the other hand, can store at least 200,000 pages of text. Its portability and incredibly large capacity making it ideal for data storage. The CD-ROM publication of some reference books like dictionaries and encyclopedias has already outnumbered the printed versions. With several CD-ROMs, desktop computers can be turned into a miniature library in which almost everything can be found. The massive storage and fast retrievability enable high school students to learn in faster and more efficient ways. Let us now turn to the Internet. This is a global network connecting many local networks. Over the Internet, high school students can retrieve information and databases from every network library around the world in seconds. The World Wide Web provides an easy way to access hard-to-find information. Students can now reach any library through the global network and find what they want. The final step is to download the scanned image. Though the slow transmission of signal through the network is a major limiting factor, it can still save us much time in finding useful information, and thus It is an invaluable tool to both high school teachers and students. Indeed, Jack Brown suggests that the internet should be an essential tool for educators. The computer has facilitated not only quantitative changes, the quality of experience has also changed. Virtual reality is a space simulated by computers with three-dimensional video and sound. Here, we can safely practice what could be potentially dangerous if it were done in the real world, for instance, medical surgery treatment. Washington Medical School has finished developing a prototype of a virtual patient on which any kind of operation can be performed. High school students can make use of this kind of simulation software to understand abstract theories in near real-life experiences. How should we assess the effect of the computer in the different spheres described above? Has it caused any problems? I have attempted to show that with the use of computers, high school students can access infinite amounts of data. Though this provides students with a wide variety of materials and the most up-to-date information, it may also have some negative effects. Mary White thinks that students may get confused by the huge amount of data available and not be able to properly select and make use of it. However, if students are guided by their teachers, they can not only get precisely what they need, but also retain the facility to access the most up-to-date information. The easy accessibility of the internet can, however, cause problems. The copyright dispute over the infringement of music and wire service, for instance, is one of the numerous problems. This problem has proved difficult to solve because different countries have different laws on the copyright issue. I have tried to show that computerization in high schools in the US has had a positive influence on students' learning style. Students today learn quite differently from in the past. Firstly, computers can help teachers instruct in the classroom, allowing students to get a clearer idea about what is being taught and possibly allowing more time for students to ask teachers questions. Another point I have made is that the large storage capacity of computers, CD-ROMs, and the internet can provide students with immense data resources that can be retrieved by simple keystrokes or mouse clicks. This increases the speed at which students learn by minimizing the time spent on searching for information. Thirdly, I have looked into the changes brought about by computer simulation software, and here we have seen the potential for teaching through providing entirely new sets of experiences. To sum up, computerization has already enabled high school students to learn in faster, easier, and more efficient ways. The process, however, has only just begun, and it is difficult to predict how computerization will affect education in the future. One thing, however, is certain: it will be an exciting and challenging time for both students and teachers. Reading 6. Global Disorder. Don't be fooled by the title of Richard Walker's sweeping analysis of post-Cold War chaos. He is not advocating some kind of right-wing philosopher's survival of the fittest utopia in which the toughest strongman will stop the rot of the New World disorder. On the contrary, the return of the strong is about the lack of control over the strong, be they greedy corporations, money market manipulators, rogue regimes, or jackbooted nationalistic leaders. On top of that, Walker wants to put a stop to it by that most unfashionable of instruments, government. The bigger, the better, preferably groups of governments acting together. The title and his basic thesis are drawn from the 17th century English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes and his successors, both British and American, who saw the state of nature as one in which the strong lived at the expense of the weak. Hobbes argued, says Walker, for a triangular relationship between the strong, the weak, and the state. The state's job would be to keep the strong and the weak apart. Hobbes was criticised for advocating absolutism by demanding huge powers for the state. But what he really wanted, Walker argues, was a state which existed to serve the people and protect them from each other's selfishness. Rights were natural and inalienable, both those of the strong to make their advances and those of the weak not to be exploited. If that were all he was trying to say, this would be a dull book indeed. Instead, Walker examines a range of current issues from the wars and political turmoil bedeviling the post-Soviet world, and the West's inability to deal with it, to the danger of East Asian, especially Chinese, rearmament, the spurious nature of Japanese democracy, and the temptation for China and others to follow the Japanese model, with or without the democratic facade. The flaws in the free market and the weaknesses and similarities to communist bureaucracy of international capitalist enterprises are further grist to his philosophical mill. Economically, he argues, global capitalism is not much different in its outlook and insensitivity to the nation-based capitalism of the end of the last century. It is complacent, uncaring, authoritarian, and incompetent. It is out of control and could engender a reaction in the 21st century not unlike the communist reaction that grew out of the capitalism of the 19th. He debunks the belief of right-wing economists and philosophers that letting the market decide will eventually put the international economy right, arguing that the forces unleashed by global capitalism are too big for individual governments. Far from undermining national sovereignty, membership of big groups of countries with single currencies, such as the one proposed for the European Union, is the only hope left for governments too small individually to counter the arbitrary destruction wreaked by market forces. A world divided into a euro currency zone, a dollar zone, and a yen zone would have the muscle to keep those forces in check. It would also have to cooperate economically as well as militarily. It could not avoid friction entirely, but the alternative would be economic instability and possibly war. The peace dividend of the end of the Cold War is being squandered. The major powers at the end of this century, says Walker, exude the same self-congratulation as at the end of the last. America is blindly and dangerously disengaging itself from Europe and the world. Germany and Japan are reverting to nationalism. China is rearming and throwing its weight about. Unless joint action is taken, we face the same global horrors as our great-grandfathers, but this time through a nuclear haze. Joint action would mean an alliance through NATO, but including, flexibly, the Russians and the Japanese where necessary, to consistently enforce the rule that territory cannot be taken by force. The world must no longer have one rule for Iraq and another for Serbia. In the vast sweep of this global review, one is occasionally left wondering where the author is heading. There are also a few glaring inconsistencies and omissions. Having warned of the threat to global security of Chinese expansionism, for instance, he fails to deal with it in his chapter on military cooperation. That leaves a gaping hole in his strategic thinking. But, by the end, Walker manages to deliver a coherent argument and a reasonably plausible set of solutions. Although he recognises the chances of getting governments to work together so smoothly are slim indeed. Walker has drawn on his enormous experience as a parliamentarian, foreign affairs analyst, and writer to produce a book that is readable, despite its complexity and vast subject matter. Whether he can get the world to heed his warning that, without a new world order, there will be no order, remains to be seen. Reading 7. Nuclear Weapons. It is generally well known that in a number of particularly dangerous parts of the world, for example the Middle East and the India-Pakistan border region, there are countries which either possess or have the technology to produce nuclear weapons. It is also worth remembering, however, that the country which possesses more nuclear weapons than any other, the United States, is the only power ever to have used nuclear weapons against people. Nuclear weapons were first developed in the United States during the Second World War to be used against Germany. However, by the time the first bombs were ready for use, the war with Germany had ended, and, as a result, the decision was made to use the weapons against Japan instead. Hiroshima and Nagasaki have suffered the consequences of this decision to the present day. The real reasons why bombs were dropped on two heavily populated cities are not altogether clear. A number of people in 1944 and early 1945 argued that the use of nuclear weapons would be unnecessary, since American intelligence was aware that some of the most powerful and influential people in Japan had already realized that the war was lost and wanted to negotiate a Japanese surrender. It was also argued that, since Japan has few natural resources, a blockade by the American Navy would force it to surrender within a few weeks, and the use of nuclear weapons would thus prove unnecessary. If a demonstration of force was required to end the war, a bomb could be dropped over an unpopulated area like a desert, in front of Japanese observers, or over an area of low population inside Japan, such as a forest. Opting for this course of action might minimize the loss of further lives on all sides, while the power of nuclear weapons would still be adequately demonstrated. All of these arguments were rejected, however, and the general consensus was that the quickest way to end the fighting would be to use nuclear weapons against centres of population inside Japan. In fact, two of the more likely reasons why this decision was reached seem quite shocking to us now. Since the beginning of the Second World War, both Germany and Japan had adopted a policy of genocide, that is, killing as many people as possible, including civilians. Later on, even the US and Britain had used the strategy of firebombing cities in order to kill, injure, and intimidate as many civilians as possibly. Certainly the general public in the West had become used to hearing about the deaths of large numbers of people, so the deaths of another few thousand Japanese, who were the enemy in any case, would not seem particularly unacceptable. A bit of justifiable revenge for the Allies' own losses, perhaps. The second reason is not much easier to comprehend. Some of the leading scientists in the world had collaborated to develop nuclear weapons, and this development had resulted in a number of major advances in technology and scientific knowledge. As a result, a lot of normal, intelligent people wanted to see nuclear weapons used. They wanted to see just how destructive this new invention could be. It no doubt turned out to be more effective than they had imagined. Reading 8. A press statement. The incident reported last Monday, when a group of imported workers from China were refused entry and detained by Taiwan Immigration Department officials as they attempted to return to Taiwan after a weekend visit to their families on the mainland, has caused considerable concern among local labour organisations. As a result of this unease, I have been requested as Secretary for the Taiwan Association of Trade Unions, TATU, to issue the following statement on this incident. The 60 workers involved were all employed by Sun Construction Company HK Limited on 2-year contracts. On the evening of 30th of January, they travelled from Taiwan to Hangzhou. As they attempted to cross back to Taiwan from Lowu on the evening of 31st January, they were prevented from doing so by Taiwan immigration officials. 9 of the workers were held for almost 10 hours before being released and allowed to enter Taiwan. A spokesman for the Immigration Department, Mr. Yin Zhang, reported to the TATU that his department had been informed by Sun Construction that the workers' employment contracts had been terminated. This information had been duly recorded on Immigration Department computers, and officials were thus left with no option but to refuse the men re-entry and to treat them as possible illegal immigrants. 9 weeks ago, all 150 mainland workers employed by the company went on strike because they were angry that up to 70% of their wages was being deducted to cover the cost of food, accommodation and agency fees. These fees were being paid monthly to an employment agency in Guangzhou, but the workers argued that such payments were not authorized. They had been assured by the agency that only a single payment would be made and claimed that their contracts had been altered once they arrived in Taiwan. With the assistance of the Labour Department and the TATU, the men were subsequently repaid up to $50,000 each in back pay. Workers argue that the incident was an attempt by Sun Construction to intimidate them. They claim that 10 of the dismissed employees were leaders of the earlier strike and that the dismissals were a warning to the rest of the workforce not to cause trouble. They also say that none of the workers had been informed of the dismissals and had left most of their clothes and money in Taiwan when they visited China. A representative of the company, Mr. Tian Zhuhong, claims that the workers' accusations are not true. The decision to end some employees' contracts was necessary because the project they were working on was nearing completion and fewer workers were required to finish it. He stressed there was no connection between the dismissals and the earlier strike. He has, however, been unable to say why the workers involved were not warned of their dismissal prior to leaving Taiwan. Although the company has agreed to re-employ the workers, the TATU is convinced that the sackings were intended as a warning to the workers, nothing short of intimidation, in fact. Therefore, we recommend that the Labour Department set up a coordinated method of monitoring all temporary contracts for import workers in order to ensure that similar incidents do not reoccur in Taiwan. Reading 9. The most popular soft drink in the world. One of the most successful commercial products ever launched is said to have come about as the result of a mistake. In 1896, Jacob's Pharmacy in Atlanta, Georgia, was selling a nerve tonic known as French wine cola, ideal nerve tonic. By accidentally adding fizzy water instead of still water to the recipe, a pharmacist called John S. Pemberton invented what has today become the most popular soft drink in the world, Coca-Cola. Along with its closest rival, Pepsi, which appeared on the market 3 years later, Coke has enjoyed phenomenal success worldwide, particularly in the last 50 years. Indeed, old Coke bottles and limited edition cans can often fetch considerable sums from collectors, and there are even stores which deal exclusively in Coke products and memorabilia. What could possibly account for the amazing success of Coca-Cola? How has this combination of carbonated water, sugar, acid, and flavourings come to symbolise the American way of life for most of the world. After all, even the manufacturers could hardly describe Coke as a healthy product, since it contains relatively high amounts of sugar and phosphoric acid, both of which are known to damage teeth. One explanation may be in the name. The original recipe included a flavouring from the cocoa plant and probably included small amounts of cocaine, an addictive substance. But since the early part of this century, all traces of cocaine have been removed. However, Coke, like all cola drinks, also includes a flavouring from the cola tree. Cola extract contains caffeine, which is a stimulant, and the Coca-Cola company adds extra caffeine for good measure. While caffeine is not thought to be an addictive substance in itself, there is considerable evidence that over a period of time the consumption of caffeine has to be increased in order for its stimulating effect to be maintained, and so sales of Coke perhaps benefit as a result. A more likely reason for the enduring popularity of Coke may, however, be found in the company's enviable marketing strategies. Over the years, it has come up with some of the most memorable commercials, tunes, slogans, and sponsorship in the world of advertising, variously emphasizing international harmony, youthfulness, and a carefree lifestyle. Few other companies have ever been able to match such marketing ploys so consistently or effectively. As suggested earlier, the influences of American culture are evident just about everywhere, and Coca-Cola has somehow come to represent a vision of the United States that much of the rest of the world dreams about and aspires to. Perhaps drinking Coke brings people that little bit closer to the dream. Reading 10. English Standard of Italian Students. In response to criticism that the English Standard of Italian students is falling, the Director of Education, Mr. Alonso Gilberti, said that there was no indication of such a decline. He made these comments after the release of this year's Italy Certificate of Education examination, ICEE, results. Mr. Alonso Gilberti is perfectly correct if one simply looks at the passing percentages in the English language examinations. However, these marks have no bearing on the issue at all. The mechanism of the grading system for ICEE subjects ensures that the passing percentage in each subject are more or less the same as those in the previous year. This is to cater for any fluctuations that might occur in case questions in a particular year turn out to be particularly difficult or easy. It is also believed that there is no significant difference in the abilities or performance of students in any 2 consecutive years. Students' performance is presumed to be stable. Another feature of the grading system is that a certain grade of a subject does not actually reflect what or how much a student has learned, but only how well he has performed in comparison to other students in that subject. A closer look at the contents of the examination papers and the way marks are awarded again suggests that Mr. Gilberti might not be quite right in insisting that standards are being maintained. It is almost invariably the case that questions require only very short answers. In many cases, a short phrase or even a single word will suffice. How well a student uses the language in presenting an answer is not taken into account in awarding a mark. Indeed, in markers' meetings, it has always been emphasised that mistakes in language, for example, grammar or spelling mistakes, or improper choice of words, should not be penalised in an otherwise correct answer. Although 4 marks are now set aside in most subjects to cater for how well an answer is presented, it is usually counted in only 1 question or section of the subject papers and amounts to about 2% of the total mark. It would be naive to think that teachers and students will pay much attention to this 2%, and the backwash effect is obvious. Teachers and students will concentrate their efforts in scoring the other 95% of the marks. Indeed, I would be surprised to see any script that has been awarded a grade D, that is, a passing grade, containing even one well-written sentence. It would be ignorant and arrogant to maintain that students' English standards are not falling. The importance of language skills necessary to Form 5 students to further their studies or for work has never been put into proper perspective. They are vital. Having said that, Mr. Gilberti should not be held responsible. On the contrary, his department is introducing the Target-Oriented Curriculum, TOC, which emphasises, among other things, that students be taught the communicative skills necessary to explain concepts and knowledge that they learn at school. The introduction is limited to Primary 1 in the coming year and only in the subjects of Italian, English and mathematics. Many schools are opposed to its introduction, but I think they are misled by its complexity. TOC is the right approach if we want our students to develop independent minds and have the ability to relate to others what is in their heads. The objection I have is its introduction in the limited scope of its implementation. Students should not be learning Italian, English and mathematics in a way that encourages enquiry, problem solving, communication, etc., and the rest of the subjects in ways which are very different. What will students think of this inconsistency? How will teachers of other subjects explain to them why they are teaching their subjects differently? We have to bear in mind that TOC is a better approach. It is high time that all teachers be more aware of the important role that they could and should play in nurturing students' language competence. Education is teamwork, and language standards cannot be dealt with by language teachers alone.